All right, we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions before our event for this evening. So my name is Sophia Zanowski. I am the Registrar and Director of Development at St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry, which, as we were just speaking about, St. Bernard's is located in upstate New York in Rochester, to be specific. And I was really just reminded, as some people were saying where they were from, why we started this Words with Wine series. So that was really beautiful. And I will actually talk about that more in a minute. For those of you who are unfamiliar with St. Bernard's, we are a graduate theological school with campuses in Rochester and Albany, New York, but we serve students from across the country and really the world through our distance education programs. We have master's degrees in theology and philosophy, and we also have graduate certificates, some of which are really niche and unique. We have one in Catholicism and the Fine Arts, a certificate in Catholic Biblical Studies, a certificate in bioethics. So those are for people who want to take advantage of the richness of our graduate courses, but not go for a full master's degree. We started this series, Words with Wine, which we do a couple of different event series and speaker series and conferences. We started this one specifically in the height of the pandemic, I think it was May 2020 when we started this, to bring people together, literally coast to coast or from all over the place on Zoom, to talk about Catholicism and the fine arts, and maybe hopefully forget about the pandemic for an hour every once a month on Thursdays. And we've just continued it because it's been such a wonderful virtual space to talk about the arts. And we decided to keep it virtual for the fall semester because we found, just as we were speaking about earlier, that we continue to draw people from all over the place, and you can only really do that on Zoom. So we've continued this event series. We have a couple of upcoming offerings at St. Bernard's. One of our other events that we do regularly is called Theology and Culture, where we talk about kind of the intersection of faith and what that means to living in today's culture. So we bring in different speakers to do that, and we have one next a week from today, I believe it is actually. And then we also are hosting our first ever scripture conference in 2 weeks, interpretation of Scripture and ecclesial exegesis. So we're really excited to be hosting that, both having people on campus in Rochester, and also that conference will be accessed, can be accessed over Zoom. So we're really looking forward to that. Now, we did partner with a vineyard out in Northern California called the New Clairvaux Vineyard, and they partner with a group of Cistercian monks. So St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is our namesake, was a Cistercian Trappist monk, so we share that in common. And we partnered with them to literally put on this event series coast to coast, New York to California, and we've been really thankful for their partnership. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. James Matthew Wilson. He joins us and has published 10 books, including most recently in 2020, his book, The Strangeness of the Good, which won the 2021 Catholic Media Awards Book Prize for Poetry. He is founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. And he's poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Liturgy. He's also the editor of Colosseum Books and poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. And the title of the event is the Sacramental Imagination, and I will let him get into that and explain what that means more.
Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. And thanks, Sophia, for this warm invitation and to join you all. St. Bernard's and the University of St. Thomas have something in common, as Sophia was indicating, and as several people I see before me now will know well. I'm the founding director of a new Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing that itself is an online program. So just last night, I was sitting with my students in this same room, more of which, or I'll have to say more about that in a second, as we completed our second week ever of classes, and it's really been a thrill. We had a huge number of people come out to want to join this program, and you'll be thrilled to know why they wanted to join it. And that's because this Master of Fine Arts program that I've just begun in collaboration with my former publisher, Joshua Wren, is the first ever Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing that seeks to root itself in the Catholic literary and intellectual tradition, and to extend and expand that tradition in the years and the decades ahead by producing new great work. So I was so grateful for this invitation for all kinds of reasons. I think some of us may be having, ready to go back to live events, and I certainly am looking forward to visiting a few places for lectures this fall. I'll be in New Hampshire just a week from this weekend at delivering the annual Dante lecture at Magdalen College, and then in October I'm going to go to Portsmouth Abbey to do an event with Robert Royal. So I'm glad that it's possible to travel again. But if there's one thing that I learned over these last 2 years, it's that Zoom makes a lot of things possible, including the founding of this new program we're doing. And I'm so glad that it's also made possible for me to join you all tonight. So in discussing what we might do this evening with Sophia, I proposed that we do something very informal. On the one hand, I want to share some poems with you. If there's one thing that I really missed during the pandemic period, it was getting to go to travel around and to give readings of my poems. I think it's so essential to remind and respect the intrinsic connection between the spoken word and the printed word, and that when those two things get very far apart, bad things happen to art and to poetry and even to our language. And so I just love going to give readings. So it's great to have a chance to read some poems for all of you tonight, excuse me. But I also hope that that maybe while I'm reading, if you just want to use the chat function, that would be fine. Or if you want to raise your hand, I'd be happy to have a discussion or answer questions about the sacramental imagination, the future of the Catholic literary imagination, and really anything that's peripheral to those kinds of questions. I would love to engage with them. So so please feel welcome to make this not just an hour or so of staring at your screen, but our genuine conversation and discussion. The reason I proposed the sacramental imagination, it's kind of a catch-all title, but it's one that's dear to my heart, and for a number of reasons. When I first began writing many years ago, and I began as a fiction writer, and then fell in love with meter and rhyme and switched to poetry and never looked back. But when I first began writing years ago, the reason that I wanted to write literature was because literature had done so much to transform me internally. I think probably a lot of us have memories of whether sitting by yourself in a park, or maybe at home at your parents' kitchen table alone, and encountering some great work for the first time and feeling your jaw just drop open, maybe your stomach drop because you couldn't believe what you were looking at, what you were encountering. And I don't have a great vocabulary to describe that feeling. I've never felt pressure to develop it, because we have that wonderful poem of the German poet Rilke from the early 20th century on an archaic torso of Apollo, where he describes the Belvedere torso that's in the Vatican Museum, and just describes it with precision, this marmoreal, broken, but still sublime hunk of human form and stone form. And after he's sort of entered into it and realized what it is, the last line of the poem is simply, "You must change your life." For a lot of us, the first experience of metanoia, of conversion, is an encounter with the beauty of aesthetic form that comes to us through literature and the visual arts, and through music. And it's usually when we've been stung or changed by that we just want to participate in it some way, to someday say, I too can do that. I too can make something that will, as Emily Dickinson might have put it, will knock somebody's head off. So speaking of getting your head knocked off, the first poem I thought I'd read tonight, actually it's a kind of Rilkean poem now that I think about it, is one that I wrote long before I ever considered giving my life to poetry. I had just finished college, and in keeping with what you do when you finish college, I took a 1980 Acura Integra and drove it in a winding S-curve across the country from Minnesota down to Tampa, Florida, and then flew from Tampa to Austin, where my brother and sister-in-law were living for the year. And when I got off the plane in Austin, they said, "We've got great news for you." I said, what's the great news? They said, "We're going to the circus." I must have had a very polite smile on my face, because that just sounded awful to me. I'm one of those people who just thinks clowns. So it didn't sound good, but we went to the circus, and in the middle, it was a Barnum and Bailey circus, and in the middle of the three-ring circus and in the middle of the 2 hours or so of the performance came the living statues. And I was awed by them. And I was awed by them because I could see that they were an instance just like that archaic torso of Apollo, where the human form seemed as if it were showing forth so much more than it literally is, that it was making itself a symbol or a manifestation of something. There were three living statues, and they formed various Trinitarian formations. And I began to think as if I was entering into the mystery of the Trinity as I was looking at these statues. Or these living statues. Rather than explain the poem away, I think I'll just read it for you. So this is from my first book of poems, Some Permanent Things, and it's simply called Barnum. After the clowns and seals and the trapeze had swung its sequined fair into the dark, out came on one ornate-tiered pedestal the living statues, their skin painted gold. To the edge of each lapid eyelid's line, rendering mortared metal, human flesh, one substance, their mundane distinction rubbed out as some cosmetic blemish lost in gold. They had crossed into terra incognita, to some small workshop where Pygmalion could chisel them just one stroke beyond life upon a raised and lighted plinth of gold. The statues ground their gears, or slow joints, from poses where their tendons strained for stillness, to long deliberate movements, more concrete in beauty than a banker at his gold. As if in his dimmed world of greed alone, the heart's debased by metal's pressing weight. Silence replaced wild whistles in the crowd as a thin molded dryad with her gold back arching stretched defiant on the earth. The central man, her atlas, lifted her into an airy orbit far from oars of hate and hunger in the sweat for gold. Another man rose on his broadening back. On one of pure strength, two formed wings in risen immobile flight, till three were one again, a single hammered trinity of gold. That show of union in the comic ring erased all thought to fools or tragedy, dispensed with all our errant words and deeds, forgot our fall and raised men into gold. This is part of a sequence of poems that I called La Rochefoucauld's Ghost. That one of the things that the sequence explores is what are the limits of both what poetry, but also what the limits of what religious experience can deliver to us how far can we enter into the mystery of things? I think I'll read one other poem from that sequence. In fact, I think it's the last poem from the sequence. And this is one that has a title taken from the great late medieval English mystical work, The Cloud of Unknowing. And I was so moved when I read that book, which is truly one of the great contemplative books of that period. I was so moved by the way in which it depicted the heart's anguish as it tries to enter into the mystery of things and know God and see God face to face. And beat upon this high cloud of unknowing. After a hard trek up loose rocks, I found myself below the peak, shaking with fears and staggering on my legs. The fog had swallowed the path behind. My memory was hollowed where your and others' names belonged. Last year's acanthus blooms wiped out. I hit the ground. I may have slept an hour, I don't know. But when my eyes turned up, they felt the press of a cloud's crushing weight, which blotted all, enshrouded all in that strange dark. I call into the raveling air. My sight grows less the more I strain for light, while I strike blow on blow against the black, whose insubstantial vault resonates like a great drum of steel. You'd not have recognized my voice, its cry. Just let me in, I beg you, or I'll die. Just let me in. And then a final peal of thunder snuffed it out. The circumstantial evidence is plain. I woke with knuckles bleeding, my throat dried to read, my head concussed. But just the same, the glowering cloud I'd fought was buried deeper in me than all thought. My blind and breathless trail and outward husk, and every fist, the self itself exceeding. So that when I finished this book, I'll pull the cover up just in case you haven't seen this, Some Permanent Things. When I finished this book, one of the highlights of it was that in the second edition of the book is a sequence of poems called the Christmas Preface, poems that took me years and years to finish. When the first edition of Some Permanent Things was published in 2014, I only had written 2, and I had a second edition of the book issued so that I could complete the sequence, and it became a sequence of 6 poems. I was actually thrilled, as it happens. Just today, I got an email from a composer who's just set one of the poems, a pantoum about the feast called the Christmas Preface. That's the title poem from the sequence. He's just set that to music, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. But one of the challenges of writing poems when I was first trying to do it were really, I wouldn't say one of the challenges, there was a twofold challenge that I faced. On the one hand, I was trying to respect the natural order and knowledge of things that human beings share in common. That is to say, I wanted to write a humanistic poetry that was civilized and reflect the ordering of the soul and the ordering of the mind that every person in the quest to become civilized seeks to achieve. But also recognizing that the sort of mundane order of human experience is founded on a much deeper order that we really only enter fully into through the gift of grace. And I wanted my poems to be able to explore both, therefore, as it were, the natural order and the supernatural order. And so those 2 poems that I just read you are early efforts in that direction. And that's what I think when I was proposing the title for tonight, what I was thinking of when I said the sacramental imagination, the way in which art manages a work of art can manifest itself as a good in itself, but one that opens up sometimes almost abyssally, as if we could drop into it and discover new worlds within worlds. So discovering new worlds within worlds, trying to find ways to make the deepest things in life and the deepest things in human experience intelligible, and in fact, to give them some kind of worthy and beautiful representation has been one of the great quests in my effort to write poems. And so when my second book was published, The Hanging God, one of the themes was precisely this perceiving of the order of the sacred within the secular, and the sacred, in fact, causing the secular to be in the first place. So I think I'll share an early poem from that book called During the Protests. It's so bizarre. I wrote this poem, I think in 2008, when Syria and Egypt had collapsed, and then Libya had collapsed into anarchy, which I suppose everybody presumed was going to be temporary before someone reasserted control. This poem, During the Protests, is probably more timely now than it was 13 years ago when I first wrote it. It's a poem that speaks of the snow, which seems highly inappropriate tonight because it's such a lovely, at least here in Michigan, we're having a really lovely summer. But humor me, if you will. During the protests, we praise the clink of plate on plate, stirring an evening suds, and thank you for the snow's refulgent weight, which settles on the hill's high bank. The warmth of this interior, its private peace, quotidian motion, is deepened by what lies before us, leavens thanks into devotion. But on the screen stream curious scenes of tanks mobbed in the desert square. We do not know what their shout means, their flags, their fists far over there. We talk of lunch and laundry, not to plumb the pleasures of distraction, but prudent toward an order thought sustaining, though not satisfaction. To train our hunger, it gives rest by freeing us of the stomach's worry. My wife's weight to my side is pressed as we watch what elsewhere is occurring. Could a day come when all is peace, not some mere fullness of the table drowsing us in each evening's ease, not just a stop to war, as stable and preferable as that may sound? For far-flung chaos, present order must find their last food somewhere, ground their axe beyond the bluest border. It's for that land we praise you, know the taste of it within our mouth, the figure of it in the snow, and in that desert rage, its drought. One of the dimensions of entering into the sort of deeper source of things that holds our daily lives in being is learning to know where we stand in response to them. Probably the book that has most influenced my life, with the exception of Dante's Divine Comedy, would be Saint Augustine's Confessions, a book that happily for 12 years I taught virtually every fall to my former Villanova students, and I'll be teaching it in the new graduate program. We decided that was such an essential text for every writer to know that we're going to make sure all of our students read it in their second year in the program. But what Augustine does in the Confessions, among many, many other things, is he slowly realizes that the book he grew up reading, which was Virgil's Aeneid, actually the plot form, the shape of Aeneas's story as he flees from Troy and goes in search of the place where he can found Rome, that story somehow gave form or shape to his own life. And as Augustine comes to understand himself better, he realizes that just as Aeneas was in a Roman pagan epic, Augustine, was part of a Christian epic, the great journey of human beings back to the God they had lost at the fall. when we make that discovery, just learning that our lives have plots too is transformative. A friend of mine is a sociologist, and he specializes in his research in trying to figure out how people think about their lives. And one of his books told a rather depressing story, which was that for many people, they don't see their lives as having chapters, as having parts, as having a plot arc. They see it rather as one darn thing after another, as a mere chronology stripped of all significance, shape, form, and meaning. And he was deeply troubled by these results. He had assumed, first of all, that the opposite would hold. That was his hypothesis. And he was deeply troubled to see his hypothesis proven wrong, not out of vanity or pride, but because it had been established elsewhere that when you can't see your life as having a shape, that's often a sign of despair and depression. The more you understand your life as a story, the more you see that story and you like that story and you want to be a character in that story, the character in that story. So meditating on that years ago, I wrote a poem just about that discovery called The Scar of Odysseus. Yes, I think he was influenced by Viktor Frankl. The Scar of Odysseus. In the old stories, on a quest for a lost grail, gold fleece, or to refound a kingdom sacked, that the hearth gods may rest, a small crew leaves its natal ground and sails beyond the limits of the West. The sons and wives who stayed behind would wonder at their wandering and wait with thoughts of monsters weighing on their mind, until a ship with magical freight appears with white sail on the sea's dark rind. Such tales can hardly fail to please, for we lap up the unknown that's made known, and sense our lives in greater small degrees look like quests too, could they be shown in all their menaces and victories. No wonder then we celebrate the bliss of bride and groom at their beginning, the perilous hours that thread a narrow strait, but somehow keep the fate spool spinning, the disembarking for a golden estate. What's more, we see a dark plot swells along the path the schoolboy walks alone, and hear beyond the girl's first kiss church bells, and feel our hearts with his atone when the bond clerk comes clean on what he sells. Their lives show ours. When we behold some soldier stiffly called away to war, or hear monks pray their office in the cold chapel, we know that their forms are those our lives take when their true depths are told. But they must not be. We have seen the maniac proclaim his destiny and suffered through dull cruise slides, scene on scene, as some fool reeled in vanity. We cannot always say what our lives mean. Not just the humble, but the wise accept the distant idyll for its feignedness, which gives to our lives' plots their just disguise. Odysseus wore a beggar's plainness, so that the truth his love alone surmise. That second to last stanza about the fellow who's all too confident in the shape of the story of his life and shows you cruise slides, reel after reel. Always, that the origin of that stanza must have been from when I was 18 and was a freshman in college, and realized that you could tell somebody was crazy if he came up to you and told you that he planned to be president someday. It was one of two checklists, two boxes. The other one was if they came up to you with a sheet of paper and say, "Here, I figured out the universe." Although it turns out, if you just read Dante, that's pretty much accurate. That's pretty true. So looks like, let me just see if there's, I see there's some, oh, somebody was asking a question. The word sacramental was sacraments and sacramental. I thought why don't I stop and talk about that for a moment? We don't always realize that when we speak of the sacramental imagination, that that as Catholics, we could be talking about a number of things. Most of us see sacramental imagination, and we see imagination being modified by the word sacrament, sacramental, modifying imagination. And we think, right, an imagination informed by the seven sacraments, which of course is true. The sacraments are those signs that, as the writer David Jones once put it, they are the efficacious signs, the things that both signal something and are the very thing they signal. And so in that, the sacraments, each of them reveal to us that there's an interpenetration or a compenetration of the world by the divine, of the natural by the supernatural. And indeed, this happens in a distinctive way with the sacraments, but it's also a mundane activity. Nothing would be at all, nor would it be what it is, as in the kind of thing it is, which Aristotle calls the form of things. Nothing would have a form if that form weren't first given to it in the gift of being that comes alone from God. And so when we encounter any existent thing, any relative being, any creature, we're always already perceiving something that speaks to us of things far beyond its own modest, literal, created self. Everything, as it were, is a symbol or a sign of something else. Everything is both what it is, but in its creatureliness, it stands in an intrinsic dependent relation to the God who made it, and therefore it speaks, as Augustine puts it, it speaks like a vicar. It's a voice that says, as Augustine puts it, I didn't make myself, I'm not God, but God made me. What that means, of course, is that the most ordinary thing, the most prosaic of things, is already compenetrated with a deep mystery. And it seems to me that it's the practice of the sacred arts and the fine arts to do a number of things, but one of them is to pay enough attention to things as they are in themselves, so that we see the world of the divine into which they open up. But of course, Catholics have that other term, sacramentals, referring to our things like scapulars and holy water, and to be crude, the various bric-a-brac of Catholic devotional life. Of course, it goes well beyond the bric-a-brac. And all of these things are called sacramentals precisely because they are finite objects, particular things that have been recognized as playing a role in the economy of grace. And so therefore, it's almost good. It's not actually the worst idea to say they're trinkets of holiness. They're little things that speak out beyond themselves and speak of great things. And so the reason that it's helpful to have that second term, sacramental, where it's not a modifier of imagination, but is just it could stand by itself, the sacramentals, is precisely because it speaks to the sort of richly woven tapestry of reality that the Christian revelation has unfolded in the life of the church. All those things that we might sometimes call traditions or just devotions, but all these things where God's effort to speak to us and to find us out have sort of taken a root in objects or practices or words that stand apart in a very meaningful sense, stand apart from the seven sacraments themselves. I think, speaking of sacraments, I'll read one more poem from The Hanging God. And this is, in fact, the last poem of the book, and it's called Autumn Road. And you'll recognize from some of the features of it that it could only have been written in the fall of 2016, where little did we know the world seemed unprecedentedly divided. Little did we know what was still to come. but it's precisely about, in its narrative, about walking through the world and awakening to the way in which things are always speaking to us. It retraces the route that I used to walk from my old house in Pennsylvania to the train when I would go to work. Autumn Road. I follow the clean-edged macadam north to catch the train. The maples hanging forth on either side, their leaves of brilliant reds, oranges, and umbers that will make their beds soon in the unmown grass that lines my street and crumble at the weight of passing feet. The people who just moved in 3 doors down have ringed their banisters in black and brown and hung a skeletal child from a swing. Its eyeless stare, a dark and menacing reminder to pray for the dead and of those horrors the coming darkness may disclose. We haven't met the tenants yet and don't want to. A glance into their yard has sown nightmares already in my children's sleep, shaking them tiered and screaming from its deep. We've heard them crush their beer cans out to smoke late at night and guffaw at some crude joke. A few doors farther on, the lawn is spiked with signs for candidates I've long disliked. Just seeing their names induces in me fear, less supernatural, but much more near at hand than those that haunt the children's dreams. But then I see that stone foundations, beams of smooth pine pitched high in the sun where 2 homes now are rising, promise something new. And hear St. Monica's bell in her tower, govern our hillside as it tolls the hour, chastening us that though our time seems dire, much has endured through beating rains and fire, and good can still be made in this dark season. I read a book last week that says our reason no longer sees the world as from God's eyes. Where the ancient mind saw signs, ours now denies to it all but the most material meaning. I'm not so sure. It seems that thoughts are leaning up against every fence post, and the earth stared at, stares back, and quietly brings to birth between us morals, words, and promises, which we might overlook but can't dismiss. I worry as a father that the year ahead will bear out omens all too clear, such that my children grown will only know the clash of good and evil's fiery glow. I stop to let the speeding traffic pass, the gutters tiled with tins and broken glass. Across the way, the Veterans Memorial with polished granite, stirring flags and aureole of silver guards the entrance to the station. Its plaque says these gave their lives for our nation. I wait, clutching my ticket in my hand for what the rough-voiced future will demand. I don't know if she's still here, but I know my old neighbor in Berwyn was somewhere on the Zoom audience tonight. And it was the house next door to her that had the creepy skeleton. I mentioned earlier that book, Some Permanent Things, concludes with the Christmas Preface. In The Hanging God, the book from which I was just reading to you, there are 2 long poetic sequences in that book, and the second of them is a Stations of the Cross. It's 1 poem for each of the 14 stations, and it's written in the Stabat Mater stanza that you all know from doing the stations at Lent. The Jacopone da Todi, the Italian poet, wrote the Stabat Mater. At the cross or station keeping, you know that one. And that the Christmas Preface poem and the Stations of the Cross poem were efforts to enter less indirectly, more directly into the spiritual life and into the life of devotion. As many of you will know, most of the great poems in the English and the modern European tradition are devotional poems. Poems of John Donne and George Herbert, of Robert Southwell, of Ben Jonson and Sir Philip Sidney, all of our great early poets. And indeed, you can extend it into the 19th century, just to mention one of the great poets, Christina Rossetti, were geniuses, as it were, at finding a way to give expression to religious piety, to devotion to God in works of art. And for many people, these works are read not because of their devotion, but because they're brilliant works of art, which is in its way a shame, but it's also good to recognize the way in which works of art have an integrity proper to themselves that, of course, is always going beyond themselves, because everything's going beyond itself. Everything's self-diffusive and is greater, as it were, on the inside than it is on the outside, to use C.S. Lewis's old phrase. So what I was trying to do was to find ways to write a poetry that could, again, give adequate representation to both religious experience, to the truths of revelation, and also to the genuine devotion that is actually very hard to express. It's easy to make poems of complaint and suffering and anguish because, oh gosh, I forget how Shelley's phrase, but something about our most beautiful songs are in our saddest notes, or something like that. I should know it from memory, but I don't, I'm afraid. It's just from the beginning of our literature, from the death of Achilles or the death of Oedipus on Sophocles' ancient stage, our literature has always had a more limber vocabulary to express suffering and death, pathos and tragedy, than it has had to express true joy and happiness. Hence the confusion that sometimes occurs to us when we hear the word comedy. Because of course we hear the word comedy, we want to think of laughter and farce, silliness. But comedy actually in its broadest acceptation should mean also works that give representation to the joy of being. And those are just harder to come by. So I tried to come by them. I wrote first, actually, the Stations of the Cross, and then I finished the Christmas Preface. And I thought, I've done it. I've finally written a poem that offers itself up in thanks, or poems. And then I was very blessed. I hope it felt very providential to me. The Benedict XVI Institute asked me to become its poet in residence and commissioned me to write a poem in celebration of the Mass of the Americas, which was a musical setting for the Mass for the feast of the Immaculate Conception, of course, by Frank LaRocca, the composer. So on December 9th in 2018, I was sitting in St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco, and the cello began to play and the Mass of the Americas began. And it was really one of the great liturgical experiences of my life. But it was also one of the great honors, because after having prayed this Mass and borne witness to this Mass, I went home and I knew that actually something that had been percolating in my thoughts for many, many years was finally going to find expression. And that was a way, one, to deal directly with what it is that the Mass manifests, but then two, what it is that makes America in its own curious way, and contrary to the typical narrative, that makes America in a deep and profound sense a Catholic country. So I ended up writing a long poem. It's a short little book called The River of the Immaculate Conception. It's a 7-part poem, and I am not going to share all 7 parts with you. But I thought, since we're thinking about the sacramental imagination, I'd read 2 to you, the opening and the closing, both of which think about what music, and sacred music in particular, do to bring not an image, but a sound of God's grace into the world. And so here's the first section of the poem, which was originally called Let Us Tune Our Instruments, but in the second edition of this book that just came out, although I haven't seen it, I had the title changed to Madre de Gracia. Well, for reasons that are too long to explain, except for that early in the Mass of the Americas, there's a beautiful Spanish rendition of the Hail Mary. So Madre de Gracia. Sunlight flows through St. Mary's windowed corners with such a grace, it seems that all commune in brilliance, and every surface serves only to magnify with its reflection the holy self-expression of the one. And in this light-filled place, the cellists tune, as if sweet union's what the world deserves, and beauty's never beat down by its scorners. A vain thought never warped our first affection, or concrete weighed the hillsides ton by ton. Such possibility the introit preserves, with its notes raised for brides as well as mourners, remembering and transcending that dark noon where Judas hanged himself for his defection, and all the rest stared on a dying sun. So then at the conclusion of the volume, at the conclusion of the poem, part 7 is called Hasten to Aid Thy Fallen People, which is another line drawn from Laraca's score for the Mass. And to make as explicit as possible the point I was making in rehearsing these poems I've written, when I wrote this poem, I was so grateful because I realized had I not written the Stations of the Cross, had I not written the Christmas Preface, had I not struggled to find some way to express the religious mystery in Barnum 20-something years earlier, I could never have written this poem, which came out in about 5 minutes, and has been in the world ever since. Hasten to aid thy fallen people. How does one make a song of holiness, or speak of music without spoiling it? They both seem more than our tongues can confess, and born above in our world do not fit. What's more, those who ascend with them are closed in on themselves, struck dumb, and all in ecstasy that they have heard seems flailing, foolish in a fallen word. But every rising strain must strain indeed to lend a form to what in truth is light, and manifest peace as if it's a deed, and give transcendence some arc of a flight. The purity of every saint will be daubed on with sloppy paint, and what no thought may comprehend or say must be taught in the staging of a play. The gift of form, because so fascinating, as we bend down to work with knife or ruler, reminds us that beyond it's always waiting some piercing light. Consider how the jeweler makes every cut upon a stone for its sake, but not that alone. His patient labor wasted if a line does not refract and multiply and shine. And any humble implement may serve to figure forth and yet conceal that light, so that high thought is felt upon each nerve and mystery is given to our sight. Just this way, things are lifted up, a chalice wrought from wooden cup, a little dust and water mixed to clay are molded into birds that fly away. The Mass is first his earthen sacrifice, but also taste of peace and heaven's throne, the gift that leaves behind all thought of price, yet where no less we raise a plangent groan. For at its finish, we are sent into the world both dark and bent, that bearing out the Virgin's hastening aid, from ruined choirs some good may be remade. So I see that the chat has opened up, but I'm having trouble seeing if there's any questions. Well, it's about the presidential madness criterion. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that anyhow. So if you don't mind, I think I'll just read you 1 or 2 more poems, and then if we could just open things up for conversation, I'd love to hear what everybody wants to talk about. I have to read 1 or 2 more poems because I've got 4 books of poetry and I read you 3 of them. So it would be like copying out if I gave up, or maybe mercy, I don't know. But my next book and my most recent book is The Strangeness of the Good, which is, as Sophia mentioned, I was pretty thrilled this summer. We just moved from Pennsylvania to Michigan. And you see that we haven't finished moving yet. That's why my shelves are empty. The house is still under construction. But we just moved to Michigan, and I got a note from my publisher saying that this book had been awarded the Catholic Media Awards Book of the Year for Poetry, which was really a thrill because most books of poetry are kind of like the paper that you crumple up and throw into the wastebasket. They drop dead from the press. They drop dead into the world. But it's so it was a real thrill for me. The title of the book, The Strangeness of the Good, comes from the poem that really shapes the whole book and naturally gives this book its title, a poem called Through the Water. I had been commissioned to write a poem for a magazine published by the Archdiocese of Detroit. They said, we have an issue coming up on baptism. We'd like a poem from you on baptism. And I thought, okay. And I thought for sure something would come to me right away. In fact, months went by and I missed the deadline. And then I think right after the deadline had passed, I was standing in the shower with water dripping down my face. I thought, oh, right, why didn't I think of this before? And this poem was one of those ones that come out like a gift. Through the Water. It has an epigraph from one of my favorite poets, Ivor Winters. It's actually a note to one of his poems about a medieval legend. So he just sort of annotates it a bit. He says, he, as in a knight or the quester in this poem, must in some way cross or dive under the water, which is the most ancient symbol of the barrier between two worlds, which of course we know because our immersion in water is indeed our death and rebirth that sacramentally takes place in our baptism. And that reminded me of all of the ways in which we're always entering into new worlds because of the thickness of the sacramental nature of things. Everything is always concealing some deep mystery within it, which is why I was just watching my daughter go out to the creek in our backyard the other day and pull a bunch of plants from the creek and then dissect them, because we're always convinced that there's this great mystery hiding inside of things. And of course, that's why every one of you, including myself, loved geodes when you're a kid, because you expect to open up a rock, you crack a rock, and what do you expect to find there? Just more rock. But in geodes, you don't open up a rock and just find more rock. You find jewels sparkling, right? And of course, oftentimes when you open up a rock, you don't just find more rock, you find a fossil or something magnificent in it. It seems that everything is trying to say to us, there's more to the world than on the surface of things. You have to go through the water to enter into the reality of things. Through the water. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers in a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, we will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden cove. In summer, pass within a stand of pines cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in, and our skies darken, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorn stray tufts of fur, a skull stripped of its hood, then turn and look down through the thickening ice in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where behemoth stalked in darkest depths that sank and sank as if there were no floor, he cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power, until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through, we're dead, but have returned, and are a new creation come to flower. Okay, so I thought I would just share one last poem with you. In the midst of quarantine, in fact, sorry, right when quarantine began, I was sitting in my room reading, and I was thinking about the way the world was shutting down, and I just began writing lines of blank verse, of iambic pentameter, the meter of Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Milton and all the more longer discursive and narrative poets of our tradition. And I realized that though we as an American people and we as a people in the world could, in many ways, could never have been further apart from each other, not only isolated in our homes, but coming to suspect one another, that the loss of trust in public institutions is an ongoing pain for us, and something that's destined, I think, to strain many of our lives for years to come. But I realized that estranged and atomized though we were from one another, that at the same time, we actually had more substantially or intellectually and spiritually and emotionally in common than we ever had before. We were all suffering through so many things, and so many of our personal, private dramas of our lives were being reflected in, rhyming with, echoing with the public events that were taking place in the news. And so I began writing a poem that eventually became Quarantine Notebook. It's a series of 15 blank verse poems that were published as I was writing them, so that they would become a kind of news journal. I wanted them to be a way that I wanted them to be published as this whole event was unfolding, so that people could use the poems as a way to just sort of reflect on what we were all going through together, even if we didn't feel together, and rightly so. And so I just want to share one of the last ones, because with its talk of magic, I think it has a little something to say about the nature of the sacramental nature of things, the way in which beauty, as what Thomas Aquinas calls a transcendental property of being, is that aspect of being, that aspect of reality that reminds us that all things are speaking to and one another, are standing in a certain formal relation to one another, and so forth. So this is April 30th, 2020. And just real quickly, in the poems, my 5 children all come up, and in this one, I think Cece, and then her slightly older brother Thomas, who's our cynic, they come into the action here. So April 30th, 2020. Last weekend, summer came to California. So all the cooped up, sheltered in place and withering to paleness citizens invaded beaches up and down the coast. A girl in her bikini ran through spray, its iridescence veiling soft, lithe legs that stretched and leapt above the silvered sand. Her hair slicked back and trailing in dark cords, her body given to the wind's caress. News cameras beamed her form around the world to show us freedom is voluptuous. This morning, though, she's locked indoors again. We saw her briefly on TV before the winds here, raging through our towering oaks and sloshing maples. Like drenched heavy mop heads, knocked down a power line and cut her out. I look up at the clouds, their ominous convoy that blots out all the sky, and know the world is angry and has other plans for us, though like a houseless leer, I may not name them. Cecilia overheard some other news. A company has turned our firemen, our doctors, cops, and nurses into dolls. Or anyway, that's how the broadcast phrased it. She sees them staring right out from the screen, those plastic eyes and smiles fixed for good. How did they turn them into that, she asked. Magic, I said. And magic, I say now, writing this in the glare of flowering sky. But Thomas steps right in. There's no such thing, he says. with all the urgency of one for whom the question's very much alive. I'm sorry, I reply. Then how would you explain how people were transformed to dolls? It's as I thought. He has no better theory. But his round freckled face is firmly set, the dimples deepening with doubting dogma and stubborn for a fact he thinks he knows. Just yesterday, I had a conversation about the place of meaning in a book. Not what the meaning was, but where it is. The young man I was talking with insisted, a bit like Thomas, that it's in our heads, not in the book at all. He mentioned Gödel, and after that I couldn't really follow. It seemed so much a thick and shaggy nonsense. We raised the question of the waterfall, the same old problem Kant and Goethe mold when men still looked with patience at the world and saw its urgent metamorphoses and wondered, was it stranger or a friend, a womb of symbols or a canvas for them? The waterfall is beautiful, we say, but are we speaking of the waterfall or what the waterfall has made us feel? Such nonsense as the young will sometimes speak to make themselves feel hardened into age. But I stare up at clouds like great gray hosts, abroad to conquer everything they see. I hear the wind set strong, broad shoulders low, and ram against our helpless house's side, and do not speak, but wait within its powers. I wait and live again in thought, just how, the other day, I bent with naked chest and leaned my lowered head above the sink. My wife stood over with a pair of clippers. She touched the shagging gray about my sides, the stiff hairs curling over ear and nape, and raised them slowly, patiently, her hand gentle and firm to keep the head in place, that locust given too much weight by others, but humble and receptive to her palm. And down into the silver drain, the dull hairs sheared in squads of iron tuft and lay absorbing droplets from the nozzle until my crown was light and clear again, and I rose up that my still lively face might turn receptive eyes once more upon the gowned and gleaming symbols of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much. So what should we talk about? Oh, it's 8:30, maybe not much.
Can you say something about why you turned away from fiction writing, other than that you were enchanted by poetry, or is it really that?
It was mostly that. I just, when I first, the day that someone first tried and failed to explain what iambic pentameter was to me, was one of the great days of my life. I spent the rest of the day trying to write, pay attention to this, John Bishop. I spent the rest of the day trying to write one line of iambic pentameter. And eventually I got it, a sonnet every day for 5 long years. And then this was when I was in college. So I went back to my room that night and I wrote 13 more lines. And 5 hours later, I had a sonnet, 14 lines. And I thought, this was the hardest, best thing I've ever done in my life. And I went back to my room every night for the rest of the week and wrote another sonnet and another sonnet and another sonnet. What was it that so entranced me? It was the number. It was the way in which words were being organized and brought into a precise and refined placement by meter and by rhyme. And that's the one thing that poetry has that prose fiction, just by definition, doesn't have. And that's what I wanted more than anything. I didn't give up writing fiction right away. At some point, just one day, I just realized that if I wanted to spend my life in love with what I was doing and enjoy, with sure that I was never wasting my time, no matter what I was doing, even if nobody else cared about it, then I knew that I wanted to be writing poems.
I have one.
Oh yeah, Father Phil.
Would you say, or here's what it's very difficult for me to articulate, but the Catholic imagination, I would say that a man or lady who's a Catholic writer, that sacramental imagination will somehow come out. Is that a fair statement?
Wait, say that one more time, Father.
Okay, so as we write, without writing about specifically holy things, that our sacramental imagination will somehow show itself on the page.
Yes, yes, I think so. I hope so. I think because it's a way of, it's a perception of reality. It's not a specialized niche expression. When I was first doing my graduate work, I was writing on the Catholic poets of the modernist period. And I had a dinner one night with a fellow. He said, why don't you write about the presence of Catholicism in people who don't believe any of that stuff? And I thought, yeah, that would be the real challenge. So I've elected to do both. But I think so, Father Phil, if it doesn't manifest itself in everything, then we begin to wonder if it's just a little niche cottage belief and not really transforming and informing our view or ourselves and the world at large, the cosmos.
How do we, as Catholics, in your opinion, there's the state of grace, and I think it's like and I think that you have like an existentialist sort of like experience with your writing. So how do we sort of, I don't know, continue our faith and not become atheists? Sorry, these are really hard things, but these are things I struggle with as a Catholic woman. How do we straddle that existentialist belief with the state of grace, in your opinion?
Gosh, I understand why you're struggling with that question, because that's in a manner of speaking, that's one of the questions that when Joshua and I started this Master of Fine Arts program last spring, that we wanted to answer. Many years ago, the poet Dana Gioia published an essay in First Things magazine called "The Catholic Writer Today," and Gioia pointed to the great Catholic writers of 2 generations ago in the United States who had such great purchase and prominence in American letters. Flannery O'Connor, J.F. Powers, they both won the American Book Award. Walker Percy won the American Book Award. I think the numbers were something like 10 out of 12 years, the American Book Award was taken by Catholic writers. And Dana's argument is Catholics, occupy a greater percentage of the American population today than they did back then, but our literary presence is all but nil. Now, he knew that he was being a little hyperbolic there. That's not quite true, but there was something that he was trying to bring out, and that was that even though we have many prominent Catholic writers, their writing doesn't really seem to be informing either the spiritual life of practicing Catholics, or doesn't seem to be hitting upon a secular or non-Catholic readership and really provoking them and transforming them. My response to the essay, I love that essay, but in fact, it really was the sort of seed that led to the founding of this Master of Fine Arts program. But I subsequently published a letter in First Things and then a separate essay on the subject that said, but that story, it's a little more complicated than that. If you look at what Flannery O'Connor was writing, if you look at what Walker Percy wrote when they were at their most powerful, they were really leaning heavily on tropes that came from actually the fashions of existential fiction and art from the mid 20th century. So they weren't really, in their practices, they weren't really as striking as they might have been. I mean, people read Flannery O'Connor today and find her very grotesque. I absolutely adore her. She's one of my favorite writers easily. And they find her grotesque, but when she was writing, the grotesquerie, people were pretty prepared to interpret it, and they got the capacity to interpret it from non-Catholic sources. As in there was
like
a broader,
like Viktor Frankl, right?
indeed.
Viktor Frankl is somebody that I feel that really kind of like brings into our faith, even though he was a non-secular, like he was a Jewish man in concentration camp, etc. So, sorry, I'm an existentialist Catholic, so I struggle with this whole, I guess, my own identity here.
But this is such a big question, because I want to propose two things. First of all, we need to find contemporary Catholic artists need to find ways to use what's available within this sort of ambient culture in order to articulate the vision of the reality that we're given by the church. But we also need to find ways to transform those conventions, that ambient culture, so that we're not merely intelligible to others because we're mostly parroting what they're already doing. And I think that's the mistake a lot of Catholic writers make in our time. They don't try to transform the art form through grace and through the experience of grace enough, even though they need to draw on the broader conventions in order to make themselves intelligible. John, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Well, thank you for your readings, those excellent poems, and I'm going to practice those I-ams tonight, I think, in this long week. I just wanted to ask some more about the sacramental imagination, sort of following up on Father Phil's question, and also the previous question. I know certain challenges to the sacramental imagination come from what Dana Gioia wrote about in that essay. I also really like that essay. I know he mentioned we have a lot of like sort of ex-Catholic writers today, but I'm also thinking of another challenge to it. I remember when weren't there people who told Flannery O'Connor that, why can't you write just nice stories? And I'm wondering if how that also might pose a challenge to a truly Catholic imagination that wants to plumb, see reality as it is versus something that's sort of kitschy. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Is that
it does? Yes. I don't know who this person was, but some years ago I gave a combination of a lecture and a reading. It's on called Art is a Jealous God. I did it actually multiple times at different universities and colleges, and the idea was to sort of explore how you can make a religious literature, a devotional poetry, plausible for a contemporary audience. And in the hall afterwards of one of these events, a woman said to me, "You're just saying that we should write for heathens." And I thought, I don't know. I'm not quite sure I know what that means. I do think so two things, John. One is I'm too Augustinian, maybe. For me, the Christian Platonist vision of the world with God's good just raining down just seems so obvious to me that I certainly don't forget about sin. I carry it with me every day, but the real drama in life seems to me to be that discovery of the eros that leads us to take joy and to take delectation in God. But there is another imagination that's perfectly compatible with that. It's one that I don't have quite as strongly, although I don't know, maybe if you read my poems, more of my poems, you actually think I do have it, but what Russell Kirk called the Gothic imagination, and the recognition that actually, in fact, I think that Through the Water poem is in its own way a Gothic poem where you find stray bones in the wilderness and you say, this is a mystery that I've just entered onto. The Gothic imagination is the one I think that we're more familiar with. And Flannery O'Connor, of course, is exemplary of it, where it's only in the encounter with pain with suffering or great grief that we're reminded of the irreducibility of our humanity. And to my mind, both those imaginaries, a sort of Augustinian Christian Platonism, but then a sort of Flannery O'Connor Gothic imagination, both of them are highly potent and absolutely essential. Unfortunately, you might say we've got the techniques for the Gothic imagination mapped out a little better. And the challenge is to figure out how you say to people, not only, hey, alcoholic whiskey priest and Graham Greene's Power and the Glory, you need to be redeemed, and you know it, even though you can't seem to get yourself to do it or to try for it. We need to be able to say, to also be able to articulate what redemption looks like, what grace looks like, and to do it in a way that people who haven't received grace yet can at least begin to get an intimation of what it entails. That seems to me the big challenge in our day.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I hope I answered your question. I kind of
Oh, absolutely, that was great. No, thank you.
Excuse me, Professor Matthew.
Yes,
I
James.
just have a quick question. Yeah, I wrote this in the chat. But I was really moved by many of your poems. They just get me talk about existentialism, like it gets me to kind of ponder things, which I really appreciated, and I thank you for that. I guess, like, from your view of your poem, I forget the name of it, but it was the one that you said that had moments of awakening. I think, like, you said that there was a poem where there were moments of awakening.
I'm afraid the last hour is a blur for me. You'll have to remember for me.
I guess, like, well, to tie that into, like, because I think you said that one of your poems, like, talks about, like, like, kind of moments where we, like, times where we feel that we arrive at something maybe we've seen many times, or it just strikes us in a new way.
Yes.
And I think you talked about in the mundane and, like, the trinkets of grace, which I thought was really well put. How could I guess, so the question that I have is, do you think you could maybe elucidate a little bit about how the trinkets of grace sort of help to awaken us, or, like, help us to have an experience or an encounter with grace that's like really novel, just sort of like something that's totally, like, where we feel like made aware of something that we want to spend more time just contemplating.
I hope I'm not saying time and again, oh, here's the most powerful experience of my life. Here's the most powerful experience of my life. And then you're going to be saying, this guy thinks everything was the most powerful experience of his life. But we're not being cheap or promiscuous with goodness in that way. But let me tell you, one of the great early moments of my life was when I went to Mesa Verde, the cliff, you know, the city built in the cliffs by the Indians in is it in Arizona? It was part of a long sort of Chevy Chase-like vacation with the family, with 14 of us going on an RV in a van over 2 weeks. And so when I was 12, so I'm forgetting where it was exactly, but we went to Mesa Verde and we saw those amazing cliff dwellings, awe-inspiring, you know, that were built, constructed in the cliffs 800 years ago. And they're so gorgeous and amazing. And one of the great joys was taking a smooth stone in part of into a little, not a pool, but just a depression in the stone. And it was clear that that's where they ground corn into meal. And I remember doing that. And then after we had toured the city, we went into the museum where they had several artifacts behind glass. And as I went through the exhibit, at one point I came upon a glass case and I looked into it, and I soon realized that what I was looking at were little clay bowls and pots that had been made by little fingers. And it was clear that as the mothers were making the pottery, the little children, to be kept out of trouble, were given a little bit of clay and were sitting there and imitating their mother's work and making little bowls and pots as best they could as well. And here these things were now still in existence 800 years later. As I looked at those pots, the whole way of life, the whole village life flooded back into reality, and I could see it all there. And I have no interest in figuring out how that happened. I just know that that happens, and it happens all the time. And so, I mean, from the perspective of the artist, I'm just thinking, what are those particular things that have a peculiar specificity about them that they will make people open up their eyes and become alert to the mystery of their own existence, and then enter into the love that causes it to be. From the perspective of our daily life, well, I think this goes back to Father Phil's question of earlier. We're a sacramental people, and that means if Catholics are sacramental people, that means human nature yearns to be sacramental. It yearns to have the absolute incarnate as God incarnated himself in his Son. And so, I suppose all we can do is to try to communicate to people the way in which the sacramentality of things is a part of real life, which, you know, is not actually as hard as it's sounding because of all of my abstract language that I feel is getting me jumbled up. That's what a really good meal is, right? If you invite somebody into your house to sit at table, kind of like Babette's Feast, one of my favorite stories, but and people, yeah, I thank you, Isaac. You know, there's that Leon Cass book that's also actually really good on a story, The Hungry Soul, that when we sit at table, we're already sensing the sacramentality of things. Nobody would sit down to dinner if there was no food on the table. There was no drink on the table. And the food and the drink are in no way irrelevant. They're incredibly relevant to what we're doing there. They kind of are the thing. And yet everything opens up, from the communion of persons to the saying of a prayer over the food, to bless the food. All of these things emerge out of that materiality of the food. So I guess the answer to your question is you should invite people over to your house for dinner.
Yeah, no, that's really enticing. And it's really like, I mean, it's like that everyday things, like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I kind of like what you said. It's just a mystery. We don't, but it allows us to, like, I think someone at St. Bernard's, I'm a student here, told me that it's like when we talk about mysteries, you don't try to like understand them, you just kind of walk into them.
Yes.
Sort of. So then to sort of feel like, and then reflect maybe like how you've done in your poems, like how it affects you and how you feel like new, or how it just totally I just think like that's great. I
have a old friend of mine who's an analytic philosopher, which is just not the kind of philosophy I would ever do. And we'd just been reading Plato's Meno together, and we were talking about the nature of the intellect. And I kept referring back to the word mystery, and being an analytic philosopher, he said, no, there's no mystery. You know, we can understand it. And I said, stop. I'm not saying we don't understand it. Something's a mystery, not because you don't understand it, not because you don't know anything about it. It's because you just never get tired of going deeper into it. You know, we dwell in it. And if God, you know, if God were this infinite light, then heaven would be boring, but we'll never get sick of it. And that's so that's how that word mystery, I think, operates at its best. And I think you said it well.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to trivialize it. All I was trying to do is just like all I was trying to do is just sort of like inquire and just ask a question. But I think with your answer made me more clear of your poems. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I know Isaac has his hand raised.
Oh, he does.
Hi, Professor. I was glad I caught your last poem, and I found the bit with your son Thomas where you say he has no better theory. I found that very funny, and I was wondering. But at the same time, in the very same poem, the last few lines lead the hearer into a more profound space. So I was wondering if you would comment on the relationship between humor and profundity in that poem or other of your poems.
So even though all the quarantine notebook poems are revised and revised and revised, and I worked on them continuously for days at a time, one of the things I tried my best to do was to capture the kind of amusing, jumpy incongruity of daily life, where humor and tragedy are often sort of jostling side by side. So on the one hand, I don't know that I have a grand theory about it, because this is just how things kind of happened. But I mean, it was really something that that the same day that Cecilia should be wondering how policemen got turned into plastic action figures, one of my students should be very cynically and knowingly questioning whether beauty was a purely subjective thing or a subjective value or a property of being. It's the same question. In the poem, I don't bother to answer the question, because I do think actually that maybe this is my Augustinianism, but I just, Augustine says he could never take materialists seriously. I feel the same way. I just don't think, I don't think when people say that things are less than they appear, or that things, when they deny that being has a density to it and an intelligibility to it, when they claim to be materialistic or nominalistic, I just can't take those people seriously, because I don't think that we have any idea what it would be like to live in a world where things didn't mean things. Even the most cynical person hears a bell and says, "Oh, time for dinner," or or encounters what we might call trivial signs and encounters trivial things of this world in the materiality of things, and all of them mean something important to him. At the very least, he sees a tree and he thinks tree. We just don't have any idea what it would be like to live in a world where the non-material or spiritual intellect isn't perpetually going out of us into the world, and the world isn't throwing itself as an object back at us, saying, "Come here, understand me, know me, think about me." That's just our daily life. And so, to my mind, materialism is just not a serious philosophical position. And for most people, when they're atheistic, they claim to be atheistic because they're materialists first. They say, well, nothing exists except matter, so of course God doesn't exist. Well, the first premise was false, so try to take that seriously too.
I just think it's interesting that the funny line where you demonstrate superiority over your son Thomas the humor part of it isn't exactly necessary, but I think it enhances the poem and prepares you a little bit with some levity and some lightness to get to the end of your poem.
So Isaac, I just have to say one thing later in the quarantine notebook, Cece comes back and I'm describing our morning prayer ritual that we have over breakfast, where I'll do one question from the Baltimore Catechism every morning after, while the kids are eating. I don't know what they're taking in. They might just be thinking about Cinnamon Toast Crunch, but I think if I just keep reading it to them until they're 18, eventually they'll get some of it, right? So I was reading them the Beatitudes, and Cecilia, who was 5 at the time, she hears, "Blessed are the clean of heart," but she can't hear it as the clean of heart. And so this all occurs in the poem. I recorded it exactly as it happened in reality. She whispers me, "Daddy, Daddy." And I bend down to her and says, "Daddy, do you remember what the Queen of Hearts said?" Off with her head. And so just after I said, blessed are the Queen of Hearts, she thinks it's Queen of Hearts and she's talking about decapitating people. Yeah, there's some funny moments in that poem. Thanks, Isaac.
Wonderful. I hate to cut it short because this is so incredible, but I also want to be respectful of time. So I want to say, first of all, just thank you so much to Dr. Wilson for being here with us this evening. I was just saying earlier today that in the year and a half that we've done this series, this is the first time where we had an artist themselves speaking on their own work instead of someone else giving a commentary on an artist. So this has really been incredible. And I can encourage you all to, Dr. Wilson does have a website where you can find his award-winning books and some of his other writings. So I definitely encourage you to check that out if anything here tonight spoke to you. So with that, I think I'll say good night. And again, of course, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.